The lecture hall on Station Verith 9 was built for beings who breathed methane at low pressure and saw in ultraviolet bands. The seats curved inward like cupped palms, and the lighting pulsed at a frequency that made the 3 human students in the room feel faintly nauseated. Not enough to leave, just enough to stay permanently uncomfortable to doctor. Maren Cole had felt permanently uncomfortable for 6 years. She was used to it. She sat in the 3rd row between her classmates Jonah and Priya, her notebook open, actual paper, which the Vest students around her regarded with something between pity and fascination. She wrote longhand because typing on a Veth interface required 4 fingers arranged in a lateral spread that human hands couldn't manage without cramping. 6 years at the Interstellar Academy of Biological Sciences, and she still hadn't figured out how to use their keyboards comfortably. She'd stopped trying. The professor, senior cataloger Ishvreth, drifted to the center of the lecture platform. Ishvreth belonged to the Veth species. Roughly translated, the word meant those who arrived before counting began. They were tall, bilaterally asymmetric, with one arm longer than the other, and a head that pivoted nearly 340 degrees on a soft cartilaginous neck. Their skin was the color of old ash, and their voice emerged not from a mouth, but from a vibrating membrane behind their left shoulder blade, which meant they always seemed to be speaking from just over their own shoulder, addressing someone standing slightly behind them. Today, Ishvreth announced, we complete our survey of Class 7 biospheres. Specifically, a pause while the ceiling display populated with dense Veth script, we finalized the Deathworld taxonomy for Academy record. Maren uncapped her pen. Deathworld taxonomy was the part of xenobiology she found most philosophically uncomfortable, which meant she paid the closest attention to it. The Academy's classification system for hostile biospheres had been developed 400 years ago by a joint Veth-Karathi committee. It assigned numerical traits to any world where biological life had evolved under conditions considered lethal by baseline galactic standards. There were 11 recognized traits. A world needed to exhibit at least 3 to earn the Deathworld designation. Trait 1, atmospheric oxygen concentration above 12%. Maren wrote it down. Trait 2, surface gravity exceeding 0.8 standard. She wrote that too. Trait 3, liquid water present in large surface accumulations. Trait 4, ionizing radiation not fully filtered by atmosphere. Trait 5, temperature variance across surface exceeding 40 standard units annually. Trait 6, biological predator density above. Class 3 threshold. Trait 7, microbial pathogen diversity index above 40, not trait 8, seismic instability. Trait 9, large-scale atmospheric electrical discharge. Trait 10, seasonal radiation causing circadian disruption. Trait 11, here Ishvreth's membrane voice carried a note of something that Maren had learned, after years, to recognize as institutional gravity. Trait 11, evidence of apex predator emergence from within the biosphere's own evolutionary chain. The presence of Trait 11, Ishvreth said, is considered sufficient for a Class 7 designation independent of other trait scores. It is the only trait which carries independent classification weight. Jonah leaned over and whispered in Maren's ear, "That one's us?" She nodded once, not looking at him on the ceiling display. Ishvreth began pulling up biosphere case files. Maren recognized most of them. She studied them independently, staying late in the Academy library on nights when the homesickness became loud enough that sleep was useless. She'd read Deathworld case files the way some people read comfort books. There was something clarifying about seeing your home planet described in the third person. Biosphere K, 7-2, Ishvreth announced. Sol 3. And there it was. Earth. Maren looked at her paper. She did not look at the ceiling. She already knew what it said. Sol 3's entry in the Academy database was one of the longest in the Class 7 registry. It had been compiled over 230 years of observation, first remote and then, after the contact accords, supplemented by interviews, physical samples, and what the Academy diplomatically called voluntary biographical contributions, meaning humans who'd come to study here had answered a great many questions about what it was like to be from there. Maren had filled out 4 such questionnaires herself. Ishvreth read the trait designations with clinical precision. Sol 3 exhibited all 11 Deathworld traits. Not just 3, not just 5, All 11, several of them at severity levels that pushed against the outer bound of the Academy's standard measurement scales. Atmospheric oxygen at 21%, nearly double the trait threshold, at concentrations that would combust the respiratory tissues of 9 of the 12 spacefaring species currently enrolled at the Academy. Surface gravity at one standard, right at the upper ceiling of what Veth bone structure could sustain for more than a week before stress fractures began. Liquid water covering 71% of the surface, present in quantities large enough to generate planetary weather systems of extraordinary violence. Radiation. The biosphere star was a G-type yellow dwarf that emitted UVB and UVC, only partially filtered by a relatively thin ozone layer. Prolonged exposure to the surface without protection would damage the cellular DNA of most non-native species within hours. Temperature variance. From -89 standard units to +57 across different surface regions, sometimes within the same rotation cycle in transitional zones. Predator density. The biosphere had, at last count, over 8 million distinct animal species, a statistically extraordinary number, with several thousand capable of lethally injuring or consuming an unprotected venom. Microbial pathogen diversity. Index of 217. The Academy scale, only 1 degree. Sol 3 required supplemental rotation. Seismic. The biosphere's crust operated on tectonic plate dynamics that generated major quakes regularly, with secondary effects including tsunamis, ocean displacement waves of extraordinary force, and volcanic eruptions. Atmospheric electrical discharge. Lightning. Sol 3 experienced approximately 100 lightning strikes per second globally at any given moment. Photonic variation. The planet's axial tilt of 23 degrees produced seasonal light cycles ranging from continuous polar daylight to continuous polar darkness. And then Trait 11.ish Vreth paused here and the hall was quiet. Not the quiet of boredom, the quiet of attention. Sol 3 exhibits Trait 11 at the highest recorded intensity in the current registry. Ishvreth said, the planet's dominant apex species, genus Homo, species sapiens, did not merely emerge as apex predators within the biosphere's existing ecological hierarchy. They systematically dismantled, restructured, and in numerous cases deliberately eliminated competing apex lineages across multiple continents. They then proceeded to engineer the biosphere itself, altering atmospheric chemistry, redirecting waterways, selectively cultivating and exterminating species across all ecological scales, in a manner that the original taxonomy committee described as, and I am quoting directly from a 400-year-old record, a brief membrane voice pause, unlike anything the classification system was built to measure. Silence. Then a Karathi student near the back. They looked like armored coral, beautiful and slow, their thoughts moving at a geological pace. Raised her frontal claw and asked, what does that mean for classification? It means, Ishvreth said, that Sol 3 would require a trait 12 to be accurately described, and the committee at the time declined to create one, on the grounds that they hoped it would remain an isolated case. Jonah exhaled slowly beside Marin. Priya, on Marin's other side, was very still, and Marin was writing steadily, every word, her pen moving across the paper in the pulsing ultraviolet light, her face composed and unreadable. She'd heard all of this before, in fragments, in sidelong references, in the careful diplomatic language that the Academy used when it discussed Earth in front of Earth students, but she had never heard it read out loud like this. Formally, from the record that IT was different, hearing it read like a verdict. Jonah waited until they were in the corridor, the wide, low-pressure corridor that Marin always found slightly too dim, the lights calibrated for Veth visual range, before he said anything. You know that's going to be in your file, he said. I know, Marin said, challenging the foundational taxonomy in front of full lecture hall. I know, Jonah. He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her. Jonah was taller than her, dark-skinned, with a kind of face that looked perpetually calm even when he wasn't. He'd come to the Academy on a Zen linguistics track and had spent 3 years quietly learning to read Veth membrane voice tonal patterns in a way that no non-Veth had managed before. He understood things through patience. Marin understood things through friction. They had been friends for 5 years. Was it worth it? He asked. Marin thought about the silence in the hall. The angled head of the Veth student by the window, Ishvreth's carefully chosen words. I don't know yet, she said. They walked past the exchange student's common area, a room designed to be neutral, which in practice meant it satisfied nobody perfectly and excluded nobody completely, which Marin had completed as the best possible outcome for her. Inside, a cluster of karate students moved in a slow, collaborative way, sharing information through chemical signals that filled the air with a faint iron smell. The thing is, Marin said, I wasn't trying to defend humans. I know, Jonah said. I was trying to make the taxonomy accurate. I know that too, because if the Academy is going to study us, and they will, for as long as we're in space, they should be studying the right thing. The Deathworld framing makes it seem like the output of Earth's evolutionary conditions is a species defined by threat, and that framing shapes how every non-human institution in this galaxy is going to interact with us for the next 500 years. Jonah stopped walking. Marin, she stopped too. You've been carrying that for a while, he said. She didn't deny it. Since first year, she said. Since I read the Karathi diplomatic briefing on human contact protocols. The first item under approach considerations was, do not make sudden movements. Jonah winced. We're not wrong to be careful, Marin said. I understand why the briefing says what it says. But careful and accurate are different things. And if we're going to share the galaxy with people who've already decided what we are before we walk in the room, she exhaled, I'd rather at least make sure the decision is based on complete picture. They stood there in the low-pressure corridor, the lights pulsing faintly around them. Two people from a death world standing in a station built by people for whom Earth's atmosphere would be lethal, trying to figure out what to do next. Each breath said something interesting. Jonah said, which part? The limits of experiential imagination. Marin nodded slowly. That's not a defense, Jonah said. That's an opening. Marin spent the next 4 nights in the Academy Library, now in a human-adjusted annex, where the furniture was scale for human bodies, and the air was a standard Earth mix. She worked in the main archive stacks, where the shelving units were built for Veth reach, where the atmospheric pressure sat slightly below comfortable for her lungs, where the cataloging system was in triform Veth script that she could read but not type, so she took photographs with her personal lens and translated them into her notebook by hand. She was building a case, not an emotional one, an academic one. The Academy Record on Soul 3 consisted of the foundational taxonomy entry, 11 supplemental notations added over 400 years, 3 graduate dissertations, none by humans, all written before human contact, and 1 brief cultural survey authored by a Veth observer who had spent 6 months on Earth 70 years ago and had, by all internal evidence, been deeply afraid the entire time. The observer's name was Sheev Kareth. Their report was thorough and terrified. They had documented human conflict, disease rates, pollution, urban density, noise speed, the overwhelming sensory intensity of a species that communicated through sound at close range. They had documented all of this with meticulous accuracy and had then concluded, in the final paragraph, that Sol 3's dominant species represented a Category 1 interaction risk, meaning approach with extreme caution and minimize sustained contact. Marin read Sheev Kareth's report 3 times on the 3rd reading. She noticed something she'd missed before, buried in the appendices, a section entitled Supplemental Behavioral Observations, which most readers wouldn't reach because the report itself was already 140 pages. It was a single paragraph that Sheev Kareth had written and then, visibly, been unable to categorize. She recognized the signs of a writer struggling to place something in a taxonomy that didn't have a slot for it. The paragraph was positioned after the main conclusions, unattached to any formal section heading. Written in a slightly different register than the rest of the report, IT read, in translation, on my 43rd day on the surface, I became ill with a pathogen, minor, as these things apparently go on this world, though it incapacitated me for several days. During my recovery, the family who had been assigned as my local contacts came daily. They brought what they called food that is easy when you feel bad. They sat with me when I could not communicate clearly. The adolescent offspring of the family explained to me, in careful simple phrases, that being sick far from home was harder than being sick at home, and that she was sorry I was far from home. I did not know how to record this interaction in any of my established categories. I still do not. Marin sat with that paragraph for a long time. Then she started writing. She requested time before the academic review board 3 weeks later. It was not a common request from a graduate student. It was not unprecedented. The Academy, whatever its taxonomic failures, had a genuine commitment to the open revision of its records. It was, in fact, the institutional principle that had made her want to attend here in the first place, before she arrived and discovered that the principle was more elegant in theory than in regular practice. The review board had 5 members, 3 Veth, 1 Karathi, 1 representative of the Drak, a species Marin had studied but never spoken to directly, who communicated through low-frequency resonance transmitted through physical contact, which meant the translation interface between them in this room was sophisticated and slightly delayed. Ishvreth was not on the board, but the senior cataloger sat in the observer gallery, which was voluntary attendance. Marin noticed. She kept her face neutral. She had 8 minutes. She spent the first 2 establishing her academic standing and her objective. Not to challenge the empirical accuracy of the Sol 3 record, but a petition for the creation of a new supplemental category, Trait 12, with a definition she had drafted and was submitting today. She spent the next 4 minutes presenting the evidence. She cited Chief Karatha's buried paragraph, which visibly surprised the board, suggesting none of them had read that far into the appendices. She cited the philosophical record, the Stoics, Kant, the Geneva Conventions, the Clean Air Act, the Convention on Biological Diversity. She cited the failure rate alongside the existence rate, not pretending that human ethics had been a success story, but establishing that the failure of ethical systems to fully constrain behavior was different from the absence of such systems. She cited the Microbial Pathogen Diversity Index, 217, the one that exceeded the Academy scale, and said every species that reaches spacefaring capacity had to survive its own biosphere. But Sol 3's pathogen load is so extreme that human immune systems evolved a generalized adaptive response mechanism that has no analog in any other recorded species. We don't have fixed immunity. We build it when we encounter a new pathogen, and we adapt specifically in real time and carry that adaptation forward. The taxonomy classifies this as a Deathworld trait. Evidence of hostile conditions, I'd like to suggest, is also the biological foundation of a cognitive disposition. We are a species that, at the cellular level, is designed to encounter the unfamiliar and update our response rather than apply a fixed reaction. She paused. That's not a Deathworld trait, she said. That's an epistemological one. She spent her last 2 minutes on Trait 12's proposed definition. Trait 12, reflexive self-assessment. Evidence that a biosphere's apex species has developed sustained cultural, philosophical, or institutional mechanisms oriented specifically toward the analysis and modification of its own behavior, distinguished from general intelligence by its recursive application. The species uses its cognition to examine its own cognition, with the stated goal of reducing harm caused by its own nature. She set her notes down. I'm not arguing that humans are good, she said. I'm arguing that the Academy's record doesn't capture what is actually most interesting about us, which is that we are aware of what we are, and we find it troubling, and we have spent most of our history trying to do something about it, with mixed results. But that's the story, not the apex predation. That. The board deliberated for 11 days. Marin went to classes. She ate in the common area. She slept mostly. Jonah made her food on the nights she forgot to. Priya said nothing about any of it, which was Priya's particular form of support. She operated on the principle that drawing attention to someone's anxiety increased it, and so she simply continued treating Marin as a normal person, which was more helpful than it sounded. On the 12th day, she received a formal communication from the board. The vote had been 3-2. She read it twice to make sure she understood which way. 3-2 in favor. Trait 12 will be added to the Academy taxonomy as a provisional category. Provisional meaning it will be reviewed again in 10 years, its application tracked, its definition refined by whatever evidence the next decade produced. Sol 3 will be the first, and currently, only biosphere to carry it. The communication included a note from a board chair, who was a Veth named Orishan, senior and decorated and deeply traditional. The note said, The board notes that this addition represents a significant departure from the taxonomy's foundational methodology. We have approved it on the conditional basis that the proposing student agrees to serve as primary contributor to the development of Trait 12's evidentiary standards over the next 4 years. This is not a courtesy. It is a requirement. If you want this category to survive its provisional period, you will need to build a framework rigorous enough to justify it. Marin read that 3 times. It was not a compliment. It was an assignment, a 4-year commitment to a project that would be examined, disputed, and likely challenged by every traditional voice in the academy system. She wrote back the same afternoon. Accepted. That evening, she went back to the library, not to the archive stacks this time. She went to the main hall. Beautiful, impractical, soaring main hall that the Beth had built 3 centuries ago when the academy was founded. Its ceiling that went up 30 meters and was painted in colors visible to Beth's eyes, which was mostly visible to Marin. A vast mural. She could only see the lower third. She sat on one of the Beth scale benches, her feet not quite reaching forward. She thought about Shikara, who had been afraid the whole time and had still written that paragraph, who had held the anomaly carefully in their notes, even when they couldn't categorize it. She thought about the adolescent girl, unidentified in the report, just the family's adolescent offspring, who had said, "I'm sorry you're far from home," to a frightened alien they'd never met before, using simple phrases so the translation interface could keep up. She thought about all the things the taxonomy hadn't captured, all the things that were hard to capture, the specific texture of human discomfort with human nature, the way her grandmother had cried at the news and also donated money and also voted and also said, "I don't know what else to do." All 4 of those things in the same afternoon, none of them canceling the others out. The Deathworld had produced something that was genuinely difficult to classify. That wasn't a defense. It wasn't a source of pride. It was just the actual thing, the real thing, the thing worth studying. 3 years later, Marin Cole was presenting at the Academy's annual Interspecies Biology Symposium. Her paper was titled, "Tour a Methodology for Assessing Reflexive Self-Assessment in Apex Biosphere Species, Preliminary Framework and 4 Case Studies." She had found 4 cases. Sole 3 was the most developed, the most documented, the most obviously qualifying. But in her 4 years of building the evidentiary framework, she had found 3 others, a species called the Vorn, from a low-gravity biosphere in the Kara system, now extinct, who had developed an elaborate oral tradition specifically oriented toward recounting the harm their ancestors had caused and its consequences, not as mythology, but as active instruction. A colonial organism from the Des cluster that had, over millions of years, evolved internal signaling mechanisms that limited growth specifically in response to detecting distress signals from neighboring organisms, a biological rather than cultural version of the same principle. And, most surprisingly, the Karathi themselves, who had a geological record suggesting their earliest ancestors had been aggressive territorial expanders, and whose current cooperative, slow-moving culture appeared to have developed not randomly, but specifically in response to a near-extinction event their own aggression had caused, preserved in their chemical memory banks with a clarity that other species reserve for traumatic events. The Karathi representative on the symposium panel had gone very still when she presented that finding. Afterward, they approached her, slowly, in the Karathi way, their armored exoskeleton catching the symposium's overhead light. They communicated through the translation interface. The delay between their chemical signal and the interface's audio output was about 4 seconds, which meant conversations with Karathi required patience and a willingness to sit with silence. "You found us," the Karathi representative said. For a second pause while the translation processed. "In your category, I found evidence that fits the definition," Marin said carefully. "The category isn't meant to be flattering or unflattering. It's descriptive." Another pause. The Karathi's surface chemistry shifted. The translation interface rendered it as something approximate. "We have not discussed this period in our history publicly in a very long time. Not because it is secret, because it is painful." "I know," Marin said. "I was careful with how I wrote about it. We noticed the interface process. We would like to speak with you first about the framework and about a longer pause, how you carry knowing of the species." Marin thought about that question for a moment. "Uncomfortably," she said. That's the honest answer. You carry it uncomfortably, and you keep carrying it anyway. The carrying is the point. The Karathi was still for a long time, long enough that she wondered if the conversation was over. Then, we think we understand that, better than we expected. Across the symposium floor, she could see Jonah talking to a group of Veth linguists, his hands moving in a particular pattern he developed to approximate Veth gesture language with a human hand structure, imperfect, but close enough that the Veth across from him were clearly delighted by the attempt. She could see Priya at the data display wall, one hand on the screen, pulling up something with the focused expression that meant she'd found a problem she intended to solve. Each Veth was there too, retired now, attending as an observer, which seemed to be the senior cataloger's preferred position. They caught Marin's eye across the room and inclined their long-armed, asymmetric frame in an acknowledgement that Marin had learned, after years, to read as, "You did something worth doing, and it was hard, and I am not sorry I made it hard." She inclined her head back. The symposium continued around her. 14 species, 22 research threads, a galaxy's worth of things not yet understood. Sitting in a room together, try to build a language precise enough to describe them. It was insufficient. It was also, she thought, exactly the kind of thing Trait 12 was supposed to explain. Not the achievement, the attempt, the ongoing, imperfect, necessary attempt. That was the story. Not that they'd come from a death world. That they'd looked at what the death world made them and asked, every generation, in every language and legal code and art form and scientific framework they could build, is this who we have to be? And had refused, every generation, to stop asking.